Hi, everyone. My name is Eric Nguyen. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm the director of the Center for Inclusive Excellence here at Framingham State University. I'm excited to spend some time with you today talking about what it means to foster belonging at Framingham State. As an institution, we have committed to this thing called inclusive excellence, to being anti-racist, but those commitments don't exist at some abstract level. Those commitments belong to each one of us as members of this community. So what we'll talk about today specifically is what role we can play in creating living and learning environments here at Framingham State where everyone feels seen, valued, and heard for who they are. I hope you've had these types of conversations in other communities and spaces that you've been a part of, and that this is the first of many conversations that you'll have here at Framingham State. So I'm going to try to plant a bunch of seeds, ask questions, and ask you to reflect on things that we can come back to. The CIE will host a number of workshops and trainings throughout the year. We have Heritage Awareness Months, and then your classes, your professors, advisors, other offices will also offer programs throughout the year that I hope you'll choose to take part in to continue talking about this idea of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging here at Framingham State. So before we get going, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that the land on which we live, work, learn, and gather is the traditional homelands of the Pawtucket, Massachusetts, and Nipmuc tribal nations. There's a long and painful history of genocide, forced removal of Native peoples from the land, both in our region and across the country, and we need to know that history. We need to learn from that history. We honor and respect the Indigenous peoples who are still connected to this land today and who are part of the communities in which we live. I encourage you to visit the link that you see on the screen. You can also use the QR code or text your zip code to the phone number on the screen to learn more. Now I want you to take a minute or two just to get into the mindset for this conversation. What do you think of when you hear the word diversity? So if you have a piece of paper and a pen or pencil, or maybe just take out your phone, you can jot down some notes. Just, is there a story or something that's happened to you that defines for you what you think when you hear diversity? Maybe there are just a series of words that come to mind and you can do a word association. Maybe you have an image or a picture in your mind of what diversity might look like, and so you want to make a sketch. Let's just take a pause for a few minutes and respond to this question. What do you think of when you hear the word diversity? Now that we've had a chance to reflect a little bit and get into the mindset of this conversation, I want to share a quotation from Ruchika Tulshan. She's a prominent advocate and strategist for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, particularly for women. And pay attention to the words that I've bolded. No one is preloaded with inclusive behavior. What that means is our survival instincts automatically put us in a mindset where we gravitate towards people who are similar to us, and we call that an affinity bias. It feels safe, it feels comfortable, but it also limits us in terms of our ability to grow and accomplish great things because we're sheltered from perspectives and experiences that are different from our own. It also means that if we want to create a truly inclusive community, we have to be intentional and thoughtful about how we go about doing it. There are three main objectives for our time together today. First, we'll define some words that are commonly used in conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. A lot of times we have a hazy or fuzzy definition of these words, and we end up using them interchangeably, or we don't use them in ways that are specific. So I think it's really important that we establish a shared vocabulary for this work together. Again, we'll talk about what Framingham State's commitment to inclusive excellence and to anti-racism looks like. And then we'll discuss our own responsibilities to creating that community that fosters inclusion and belonging. And again, I'm going to keep coming back to this word, intentionality. We have to do it with intention. So here's a word cloud. Diversity runs right across the screen, and there are lots of other words that are associated with it. And maybe some of those words are words that you came up with during your reflection a few minutes ago. It's not an exhaustive list, and we're not going to talk about all of these words today. But I do want to dive in, like I said, and define some of these words. Before we do that, there's just a short activity I'd like you to try. So I want you to hold your finger up, or you can hold a pen or pencil up and just point it at the ceiling and raise it so that it's above your head. And once you do that, I just want you to start spinning your finger either direction and just keep going throughout this entire thing. As you're listening to me, just keep that finger spinning. I want you to look up and figure out which direction your finger is spinning. Is it spinning clockwise, the same direction that a clock spins? Or maybe it's spinning counterclockwise, the other direction. And just take note of that. Keep spinning the finger, keep spinning the pen or pencil. And as you're doing that, I want you to slowly lower your hand and keep spinning. Don't change the direction until it's below your eyes. So now you're looking down on the spinning. And again, describe the direction. And if you've done this correctly, what you'll notice is that it seems like your finger is spinning in the opposite direction that it started in, even though you know you have not actually changed the direction that your hand was spinning. So what's going on here? Or what's the point of this? The idea is that there are things that are going to happen. And depending on your perspective, how you're looking at it, which is often shaped by our identities, right? By diversity and prior experiences, we might see things in a certain way. And somebody else might be looking at that exact same thing and describe it in a totally different way. And it doesn't mean that one person is right and one person is wrong. It means that both of you have to figure out how the lenses through which you see the world, through which you see experiences, shapes your interpretation of that event, how you describe it. And that's the challenge, is to come together around those differences, to recognize that even though we're seeing things differently, there is a way for us to come together and understand one another. So I've used this word diversity a lot now. What does it mean? Well, diversity refers to the qualities, characteristics, backgrounds, experiences, perspectives that make each of us unique. And we bring those identities into our experiences, interactions with other people. We have personal identities, ways that we see ourselves and can control to some degree. And we also have social identities, identities to which society has ascribed some value, for example, gender or race or age, sexual orientation. And there's more about this on the next slide. The thing for us to keep in mind is that just because you have a diverse community doesn't mean that you're good to go. We have to intentionally create spaces where people who hold the different identities can come together, learn from one another, and grow together. What I'd like for you to do now is to think about what your own identities are. And again, we're not asking anyone to share today. I just want you to do some self-reflection. But if you're looking at this wheel, and again, it's not exhaustive, there may be identities that you hold that are not represented on this wheel. Just take a few minutes and jot down some notes. How do you identify in terms of these different identities? How do you identify in terms of your gender, your race and your ethnicity, your age, your ability, religious beliefs, and so on? So we'll hit pause and take a few minutes to jot down some notes. All right, now that you've had a chance to think about your own identities, there are a series of questions that I want you to think about. So I'll ask those questions and then give you some more time just to reflect on them, maybe make some notes for yourself, things that you can think about. First, I want you to think about this idea of salience or relevance. What I mean by that is, which of these identities is always present for you? Do you always think about? Versus which ones maybe you never think about or only come up for you in certain situations or with certain people? I also want you to think about visibility. Which of these identities can people know about you just by looking at you versus which ones are invisible? People would not know unless you told them about it. Which of these identities do you feel like you have control and agency over versus which ones do you feel like other people control for you or define for you in some way? Development. Which of these identities do you feel like just come naturally to you versus which ones do you feel like you have to work at over time to create or develop for yourself? And then finally, this idea of sharing. Which of these identities do you feel as if you share openly with other people and share readily with other people? And which of these identities do you hold to yourself? And when might you choose to share with somebody what those identities are? So I'll take 3 or 4 minutes now and just reflect on those 5 categories in relation to your identity. So thinking about your salience, visibility, control, development, and sharing. And we'll come back and continue to talk about this idea of identities and diversity more. What we're looking at here is a wheel of power and privilege, which was created by educator Sylvia Duckworth. And it illustrates a few things. It takes some of those identities that we saw in the last wheel, and it breaks it down into positions of power and privilege. And what you see at the center of the wheel are those identities that hold power within our society. Whereas what you see on the outside or the margins are those identities that hold less power or privilege in our society. As you look at the wheel, you might also begin to see that some people, including you, might occupy a lot of space in the center of the wheel. You have a lot of power, you have a lot of privilege. So we want to think about what we can do with that power and privilege as we push the needle closer to equity and justice in our society. Others, and a lot of us, might possess a mix of privileged identities and marginalized identities. So we might have power in certain situations. We might lack power in others. In order for us to understand power and privilege, we can ask one question, which is, what identity is the default? What identity seems to kind of control the conversation or decisions? Here's some examples. This year, as we headed towards the Olympics, there was a ban on soul caps, swim caps that can accommodate Black hair, afros, braids, and so on. And the argument was that these caps are not the natural shape of the head, which leads us to ask, who defines natural shape of the head, or what is considered the natural shape of the head? If we are filling out a form and they're asking for your gender identity, maybe there's only male and female listed. No non-binary, trans, two-spirit. What does that do for someone who does not identify with the gender binary, male or female? Maybe there are assumptions about your ability to pay for certain services. As we went into COVID and the pandemic and school over the past year, there may have been assumptions about ability to learn from home in distraction-free environments, access to technology as people made decisions about how to deliver education. So now I want you to take a few minutes and think about your own identities in relation to power and privilege. Which identities do you hold that are closer to the center of this wheel? And which ones do you hold that are on the outside of the wheel? Next, we're going to define equity. There's been a lot of conversation about equity in the past year, especially in contrast to equality. I'll show you another diagram in addition to this one that both illustrate why equality, treating everyone the same way, regardless of who they are, does not always create the outcomes we desire. The reason is because the world is organized around unequal systems and structures, and we need to treat and invest in people differently in order to maximize outcomes for everyone. In this diagram, everyone is trying to watch the ball game, but notice how the ground is sloping downwards and the fence is sloping upwards. That represents sort of the outside environment, things that we can't necessarily control. There's nothing inherently different about the people here, but their environment creates advantages for some people while disadvantaging other people. And if we treat everyone the same way by giving everyone one box, it doesn't actually help certain people. Equity, on the other hand, recognizes that each person might need something a little bit different in order to reach the outcome we desire, and it provides those resources in order to make that happen. Here's a newer illustration that gets at the same principles. Notice again that equitable treatment requires that we acknowledge the root cause of the issues and then give each person what they need to succeed. So we have folks who are trying to get some apples off of this tree or fruit off of this tree. And in the upper left quadrant, there are just unequal access to opportunities. The tree is leaning one way and there seems to be more fruit on one side of the tree. If we treat both people equally, we give them both the same ladder. And again, because of the lean of the tree, one person has access and the other person doesn't. Equity now recognizes that each person might need something a little bit different in order to be successful. In this illustration, what I love about it is that it takes things one step further, and it says, let's think about justice. Let's think about how we might correct the systems and structures and eliminate the root causes of the inequalities, the root causes, the issues. Let's fix that system so that everyone has access to the opportunities and resources. And notice at this point that if we are truly in a place where justice has been achieved, we can begin to think about treating everyone equally. Notice how in this lower quadrant, both people do now have the same ladder. And then this idea of inclusion and belonging. And these are words that get used a lot in conversations about diversity and equity, and they get used interchangeably, even though there are subtle differences between the two. To me, inclusion is a behavior. It's something I can do when I create space for other people to join my activities. But I don't necessarily have to think about how the identities others bring to the table will impact their ability to engage. An example of this might be, let's say I'm teaching a class about families in the United States. And I can say, this class is open to anyone who wants to attend, right? If you're interested in talking about families in the United States, sign up for this class. I'm being inclusive. Anyone can be part of this. But then all of the examples I use in my class are about two-parent, heterosexual, married couples. Let's think about that for a second. So if you're a student whose parents are gay, if you come from a single-parent household, if you grew up in the foster care system, it would be really difficult for you to feel like you matter in my class because I've completely ignored your reality and your experiences. It would be really hard to say that you feel like you belong in this class or in this community or environment, even though I have said, you're included, you can be part of this. So it's why when we're talking about representation, it's so important for us to be able to see people who look like us or be with people who have shared the experiences that we've had across the board. What we're looking at here is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You may have seen this in other contexts. Those of you who are psychology majors are going to learn a lot about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And Abraham Maslow argued that there are needs that human beings have, and he created a hierarchy so that our more basic needs are at the bottom, at the base of the pyramid, while more advanced needs are at the top. Our basic needs at the bottom are really about survival. We need air, water, food, shelter. And then it becomes about safety. Right in the middle of this, love and belonging. And that's what we're talking about today. And the reason this is so important is that without satisfying these more basic needs towards the base of the pyramid, it is really hard to get towards the top. Things such as respect, self-esteem, so our confidence in ourselves, and then self-actualization. What that refers to is our ability to reach our full potential. Things like going to class, focusing on our academics, preparing for our future, being productive citizens and community members. Those things might be out of our reach if we don't feel safe, if we don't feel a sense of belonging. Why does this matter at Framingham State? Why is belonging so critical then? Well, I'm going to pose a series of questions, and it's not an exhaustive list of questions. And I'm not actually even saying that Framingham State does this well or doesn't do this well, especially because the reality is there's always going to be work that we have to do, and there's always going to be room for us to grow. But these are examples of questions that you can ask to begin to understand how systems of oppression based on our identities might impact our experiences. And I think they also begin to get at why it's so important for us to be intentional about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in our institution. These are things that are so ingrained in us that oftentimes we don't even think about them, particularly if they concern identities for us that fall at the center of that wheel, right? Where we hold power, where we have privilege. So let's look at some of those questions. First, what race-based or identity-based hate incidents have taken place on campus or even within our local community, because we're not sheltered from everything else that's going on around us? What holidays do we recognize and celebrate For example, if you are Christian and you celebrate Christmas, you can be assured that you have that time off. Whereas if you are Jewish or Muslim, are your important holidays recognized in our calendar? How are you able to celebrate and balance that with being a student at Framingham State? Does the composition of the staff, faculty, and administrators reflect and represent that of the student body? And again, we talked about the importance of representation and having people who share our lived experiences being part of the decision-making process. How do we value languages other than English? We talk a lot about the importance of being bilingual. I'm sure there are lots of folks in this room who speak another language. Maybe your first language was not English. Mine was Vietnamese. So how do we value that in our community? Or do we ignore that even though we say it's a value? What is the culture surrounding names and gender pronouns? Do we truly respect, include, create a culture of belonging for folks who don't fall within gender binary structure? And then this idea of ways of knowing whose knowledge or experience counts, or what knowledge or experience counts. I think about this a lot in terms of applying to college or applying for jobs, that there seem to be certain boxes that we expect people to check. And if you don't check them in just the right way, you're discarded or seen as unqualified. An example of that might be, needing certain internships to learn certain skills like time management. But then I think about the pandemic, the responsibilities that a lot of us might have had at home. And if we're helping younger siblings attend remote classes, how could you say that that person has not developed time management skills or has not developed significant responsibility? And it happens in a non-traditional context where you're not in an office or a work environment. But do we recognize those experiences? Do they count? Or do we just discard and ignore them and say, well, you haven't gained the experience in a certain way, in the right way? So those are some questions for us to think about. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, but as we think about this idea of belonging, those are some of the kinds of things that come up for our students day to day. So now let's talk about Framingham State's commitment to inclusive excellence. Part of our mission statement talks about preparing students for a productive life enhanced by learning and leadership. It contributes to a culturally diverse world. Our mission statement is really about who we are, what we value. And then as we talk about values, one of them is creating an inclusive and collaborative community, encouraging a supportive, diverse, collaborative, cohesive environment. So as you go through your experience, I want you to think about two things. One is, what can you do to make sure that we are living out our mission and living out these values? And also, is the institution or other people here also doing the same so that you feel that sense of belonging that you deserve in order to be a fully productive member of our community? Our strategic plan, which is basically a roadmap or a guiding plan about how we're going to accomplish our goals. Vibrant, inclusive community where everyone will enrich campus life with their presence and engagement. We also want to foster a climate that ensures every member of our campus community has the opportunity to thrive and succeed. Again, as you go through your experiences, do those things ring true for you? Last year, in light of the events of 2020, the ongoing murders of Black and Brown people at the hands of law enforcement officers, gross disparities in healthcare, rates of infection and death due to COVID-19, and many other instances of systemic racism in our society, Framingham State, our president Cevallos, recommitted us to this idea of being anti-racist. It's important to note that because Framingham State is part of the broader society, we are not immune to systemic racism. So we have to be intentionally committed to being an anti-racist institution. And what does that mean? I'll draw my definition of anti-racism from Dr. Ibram X. Kendi's work. And what that really means is that we need to evaluate our policies, our practices, our structures to look at ways in which they might intentionally or unintentionally lead to disparate or different outcomes based on how people identify based on their race. We might look at admissions rates. We might look at retention. We might look at access to different opportunities like leadership. We might look at the ways in which we discipline students. And are there ways in which race somehow impacts the outcome, such that some people receive better treatment, other people receive poor treatment? Here are two excerpts from President Ceballos' letter to the community. We've begun an intentional process of evaluating and restructuring processes and programs. That includes looking at our curriculum. Who are we teaching? What are we teaching? What ideas are students engaging with? And also, we're going to work together to ensure the physical and psychological safety and success of our communities of members of color, especially our Black community. This comes down to thinking about representation. This comes down to creating opportunities for students to voice their concerns, to speak out against instances of racism that they experience on campus. And we need to be prepared to listen, to learn, and to respond to those incidents. Finally, I want to talk about some resources that you have at Framingham State. The Center for Inclusive Excellence, your Foundations and RAMS courses, and really all of your courses, your professors. We have a bias education response team. SILD, the Student Involvement and Leadership Development Office, has a lot of resources for students. We have a Council on Diversity and Inclusion that meets monthly, and we invite students to attend those meetings. And we have lots of programming as well. So definitely keep your eyes and ears peeled for opportunities to engage with these different resources. We also have a number of identity-based affinity groups here on campus, and these fall under the umbrella of student organizations. So if you see an organization that you want to join, it's there. If you don't see an organization that you would really like to be a part of, you can talk to me, you can talk to the folks over in SILD about how you might start your own club. But these are really great opportunities to center particular identities and experiences. And what I have loved as I learned about this is that these clubs are open to everyone. So we have white students who attend Black Student Union meetings. We have female identifying students who attend Brother to Brother. So these groups are really meant to center these identities and yet are open to everyone to come together to learn, to engage, and to build this inclusive community that we're striving for. And let's talk a little bit about action. What can we do? Some of our actions are really about increasing awareness. We need to take time to know ourselves and the identities we hold. So we kind of started doing that earlier with that identity wheel. What I encourage you to do is to attend one of our identity workshops this year to really delve into those topics. Only after we know ourselves and our identities can we check our biases and the assumptions that we might have. We might also be able to leverage the power and privilege that we hold in order to create that more just and inclusive community that we're looking for. We need to broaden our understanding of history. Do we really understand the legacy of racism and how that continues to impact us today? Do we understand, like I said at the beginning, the legacy of forced removal of Native peoples from the land? Are there events in our history that have been completely erased that we're only now learning about? For example, the Tulsa massacres or Juneteenth. How might we expand our social and professional circles so that we can add new perspectives and narratives? And part of that then requires that we accept criticism and feedback, that we listen to learn and do better, because we're not always going to get it right. We can also then begin to take action to change systems, change the way things are. We can challenge our own and others' assumptions and beliefs. We can ensure representation and leadership and at the decision-making table. For example, if you're part of a club, look around at leadership. Is there strong representation at the table? We can begin to rewrite harmful narratives. Are there certain stereotypes or biases that we have? Are there different stories that we can replace them with to create a more full understanding of what's going on? And for those of us who might hold marginalized identities and may face systemic oppression, we need to surround ourselves with people who see our strengths and who will uplift us. And it's always important to engage in self-care. That challenging and trying to dismantle systems of oppression can be really stressful. It can be really draining, and that we also need to know when to step back, take a break, take care of ourselves before re-engaging. There are lots of opportunities to learn more. Like I mentioned, there are going to be lots of opportunities to engage in workshops and trainings throughout the year. Through this CIE, here an example of some that we'll be offering. I mentioned the intentional identity development workshops, learning more about biases, internal or unconscious biases, understanding microaggressions, trainings for folks who want to be allies to our undocumented students and community members. And we have Heritage Awareness Month programming really throughout the year. So I'll leave you with a quote. This is something I like to say a lot, but in this work, it's not easy. It's something we have to work at. It's something we have to be intentional about. And the challenge before us is to acknowledge and accept that another person's lived experience is just as valid and real as our own. How can we step outside our own shoes, our own skin, and take on someone else's experiences and really try to understand how they see the world, especially when it's different from our own? So thank you for taking the time to be here and to listen. If you have questions, I encourage you to reach out to me. Send me an email, set up a meeting, come visit the Center for Inclusive Excellence. Let's have a conversation. And I also hope that some of the questions and ideas that have been sparked for you today become part of your conversations with your classmates, with your RAs, with the other folks that you're coming into contact with at Framingham State as well. Thank you.